Since we met last, we talked about Nebuchadnezzar. And after Nebuchadnezzar, there were a few kings that took the throne in that span of time. And now we come to the last king, and that is King Belshazzar. I am going to be reading the chapter as I usually do. Chapter 5. And we will go right in depth into the story behind the story right after we are through reading the chapter. So let us begin. You can follow along on the screen. Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 through 31. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. Now, while Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Let me just mention here before I go to verse 3. You will see this mentioned again, Nebuchadnezzar, the father of Belshazzar. Now, in the Bible, the word father can mean real father, it can mean grandfather, it can mean predecessor. In this case, it means grandfather, because Belshazzar was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was not his real father, it was his grandfather. But the word father in Aramaic can mean, as I said, father or grandfather. So I just wanted to make that explanation so that you can understand what it means by the word father. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, while they were drinking and partying, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. He was scared. The king summoned the enchanters, the astrologers, and the diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, you remember we saw these terms in previous chapters. These are all titles for the wise men of Babylon. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. I think it would really help if everyone were to mute their mics. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. I'm going to talk about this in a little while, but you remember I just said that the word father doesn't necessarily mean real father, it could be grandfather. Well, here, the word queen does not refer to Belshazzar's wife, it refers to his mother, who was also the queen, who was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. But they use the word queen here. His wife, Belshazzar's wife, was already in the banquet hall. But the mother queen, she, when she heard the voices, came into the banquet hall. May the king live forever, she said. Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has a spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, grandfather, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belshazzar, that was his Babylonian name, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him,
is it too spicy, the chicken?
Okay, could everyone mute their mics? So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father, the king, brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and the enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it, Daniel. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered the king, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father or grandfather, literally, Nebuchadnezzar, sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor because of the high position he gave him. All the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, you have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver, of gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written. This is Daniel speaking now. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. I have put beside it the meaning. Mene means numbered, tekel means weighed, upharsin means divisions. Here is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and you have been found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Now I need to explain something before I go to the next slide. You will notice that in verse 28, the word is Perez and not upharsin as it is in verse 25. The reason for that is Perez is singular. Upharsin is the plural of Perez. And so Daniel was trying to explain to Belshazzar what was going to happen. Your kingdom, your kingdom, which is single, your kingdom, Perez, will be divided. It's a divided kingdom. Perez is a divided kingdom. But when you go back up to 25, the kingdom is going to be split into two for the Medes and the Persians, and so you have the plural upharsin. So it's the same root word, only one is singular and the other one is plural. Verse 29, then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Now we get into the story behind the story. Both chapters 4 and 5 of Daniel portray in graphic terms God's sovereignty over the kingdoms of the world. In Daniel 4, you remember we did that last week? God took away the power from Nebuchadnezzar for 7 years. In Daniel 5, God removes the power from Belshazzar and brings the Babylonian kingdom to its end. God is in control of all of the kingdoms of this world, from the creation right on down to this day, and even to the second coming. He is in control. The events narrated in Daniel 5 took place in 539 BC. We're going to be seeing more of this later on in the chapter. On the night Babylon fell to the Medo-Persian army, that's 539. This was the transition from gold to silver in the image of Daniel 2 that we looked at a few weeks ago, as God predicted. You remember this image? The head, gold, represents Babylon. The chest and arms represents Medo-Persia. And here we see tonight the fulfillment of that prophecy that God gave in chapter 2. But you remember, Nebuchadnezzar said, I don't like this picture. I am going to make the image totally gold. Babylon is going to rule forever. But here we see the fulfillment of God's prediction that Babylon will come to an end. And this is what's happening in chapter 5 of Daniel, just as God predicted. And God predicted this hundreds of years before. Now, Daniel 5 opens with Belshazzar holding a huge feast for 1,000 of his guests. Large feasts were common in the courts of the ancient world. Kings loved to throw parties with extravagance and luxury to show their greatness and confidence, always throwing a party. It may seem strange that at the very time Belshazzar was calling a feast or a party, the Persian army was just outside the walls getting ready to attack the city. Was not this a foolish time for Belshazzar to be involved in such a celebration? He is inside drinking wine, partying, and the army is outside getting ready to attack Babylon. It might look foolish at first, but in light of all of the defenses behind which this banquet took place, we can better appreciate Belshazzar's self-confidence. Let me explain why Belshazzar was so confident. Babylon was defended by 4 sets of walls. 4 sets of walls. You might have one wall around your house there in Jamaica or in the United States or Canada, wherever you are. You might have one fence, one wall. Babylon had 4. The 2 inner walls were 12 feet high and 22 feet thick, each wall. Each wall, 12 feet high, 22 feet thick. The 2 walls that were made up of the outer defenses were 24 feet high, just a couple of feet higher, and 26 feet thick. So you can see the picture here now. Those 4 walls, a sure defense. Now, it must be stated, if you can see the picture on the right there, you will see towers. Babylon had towers. Those towers were 100 feet high, and soldiers were on top of the towers looking out. So you had the 4 walls, but you also had towers 100 feet high, and soldiers were on top of those towers. So Belshazzar felt very, very secure. Therefore, any army who wanted to get into the inner city, where the palace and main temple were located, had almost 85 feet of walls to get through or over. And these came in 4 different sections, all of them defended by soldiers. No wonder Belshazzar felt secure enough to hold a feast in spite of the attacking army outside. That's why he was so confident. Now, the invitees to this feast included the upper class of official Babylonian society. Anyone who was anyone important was invited. The king also invited his wife, the queen, his secondary wives, the concubines from the royal harem. A significant point to notice about the feast is that Belshazzar brought out the vessels that had been taken from the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem and used them as receptacles from which to drink alcohol. Why did he do this? Clearly, the use to which he put these vessels indicated his contempt for God. Let us think about the implications for a moment. For Belshazzar to drink from the vessels that had come from the Lord's temple in Jerusalem was an expression of the superiority of his God, Marduk, over that of the Jews, Yahweh. So, in other words, my God, Marduk, was able to make me successful in going to Jerusalem and capturing these captives, Daniel, his 3 friends, and others, and also to take the temple utensils. In other words, he was saying Marduk is more powerful than Jehovah God. That was contempt. While Belshazzar and his nobles were partying, they were shocked when a writing appeared on the wall. Belshazzar was frightened. His legs gave way. He turned pale. Everyone wondered what the strange writing meant. An immediate search began for someone who could read the mysterious writing. Belshazzar, just like Nebuchadnezzar, called in the wise men to clarify the mysterious writing. To make sure that they gave their best, the king promised them extravagant gifts and honors. 1, purple clothing, a color worn by royalty in ancient times. 2, a chain of gold, which was a sign of high social status. And 3, the position of 3rd ruler in the kingdom. Now, why did Belshazzar say the person who interprets this will get the 3rd? Why not the 2nd position? Why the 3rd? Well, there's an explanation for that. Belshazzar was offering the 3rd position in the government simply because officially Belshazzar's father, Nabonidus, was still the king of Babylon. Belshazzar was co-king or co-regent and was 2nd in command. Even though he operated like a king, he was 2nd to his father, Nabonidus. Therefore, he could only offer the 3rd place to the person who could interpret the writing on the wall, simply because position 1 was Nabonidus, position 2 was Belshazzar, and so position 3 was vacant. The person would get that position. The writing on the wall was in Aramaic, which, like Hebrew, is written only in consonants, no vowels. And it was so short that though they could read the individual words, they did not understand their meaning. That is why you saw many tekelu parson. The news reached the ears of the queen. You remember I explained to you earlier who this person is? Not Belshazzar's wife, but his mother, who was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And in the Bible, the word father and the word queen can be used for different individuals. So let me read it again. The news reached the ears of the queen, who had not been present in the banquet hall. She was most probably Nitocris, daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, wife of Nabonidus and mother of Belshazzar. So let me read that again. Her name was Nitocris, daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, that we've been studying, and the wife of Nabonidus, who was number one in the kingdom, the first king, but he was not living in Babylon at the time. He had moved away to another city, and he told his son Belshazzar to rule in Babylon. She was not one of Belshazzar's wives because they and the concubines were already at the feast. You remember we read that in the chapter. They were already in the feast drinking and partying. The queen came in because she remembered the old days. 55 years earlier, Daniel had served at the court of as a wise man, superior to all of the other wise men of Babylon. On at least 2 occasions, Daniel had been able to unlock the mysteries of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, and this stuck in the memory of the queen. The queen described Daniel to the king this way: the prophet has the spirit of the holy God, light and understanding and divine wisdom, excellent spirit, knowledge. He's capable of understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles. He was chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, soothsayers. In other words, he was chief of the wise men in Nebuchadnezzar's time. Belshazzar knew Daniel. I have put this here because when we look at the way in which Belshazzar addresses Daniel, it appears as if Belshazzar did not know Daniel. But when we take into consideration that in Daniel chapter 8, it states there that Daniel had served until the 3rd year of Belshazzar. So Belshazzar should have known Daniel. He was there in his court. Look at verse 1. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision. We're coming to this in a few weeks when we get to chapter 8. After the one that had already appeared to me. Therefore, the old prophet was not any stranger to the king. So someone may wonder, why was Daniel ignored up to this point? Why was it that Belshazzar did not know the prominence of Daniel? We're not sure. We can only surmise. Daniel had no difficulty interpreting the words. But before he did so, he told the king the reason for the impending tragedy. Daniel scolded the king on 3 counts. First of all, for not learning from the experience of Nebuchadnezzar, his grandfather, particularly when he was expelled from the throne for a period of 7 years. Therefore, Belshazzar should have known better. But you, his son, Belshazzar, or grandson, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all of this. Secondly, Belshazzar had used the temple vessels in order to drink wine and to praise his false god. That was a sin against the God of heaven. Thirdly, the king had neglected to glorify God, the one who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways. Remember, we read that in verse 23. By recounting the history of Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel reminded King Belshazzar that it was the Most High God who had granted Nebuchadnezzar and also Belshazzar the authority to rule Babylon. He pointed out that at the end of Nebuchadnezzar's insanity, the king acknowledged that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men. God is in control. The writing consisted of 4 words in Aramaic. Daniel read them out as Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. He then proceeded to give the interpretation, numbered, numbered. That word is used twice, weighed, and found, and divisions. The repetition of the first word is a solemn emphasis, just like Jesus' words in John 5:24, where he says, verily, verily, you remember that verse? Verily, verily, if you keep my words, you will be saved. Verily, verily simply means truly, truly. It means emphasis, solemnity, and numbered, numbered. Oh, that was some solemn condemnation on Belshazzar. Mene means numbered because the days of Belshazzar's reign had been numbered and God had decided to call a halt. Tekel means weighed. Belshazzar's life and actions were placed on one side of the scales, so to speak, and God's law on the other side. Belshazzar's side, unfortunately, was found wanting. Perez means broken or divided. Belshazzar's kingdom was about to be broken and given to the Medes and Persians. God's message to Belshazzar was clear and unmistakable. I have given you the past to draw from and have allowed you time to correct your behavior and get to really know me. You have not done so. You have been found wanting. That night, the Medo-Persian army struck and killed Belshazzar. Now, God was not rash in his condemnation. Belshazzar had all the time and all the history to change his heart and to serve the God of heaven. But he was stubborn, he was arrogant, he was proud. His life came to an end that night by the Medo-Persian army. You might ask, how were the Persians able to penetrate the seemingly impregnable defenses of that city in order to go into the city and kill Belshazzar? This is explained by the Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote about the event. Herodotus was a contemporary, and so this is what he stated. He stated that Cyrus diverted the river Euphrates by redirecting its flow, causing the river level to drop as it went beneath the city wall. Remember what I said? Babylon had 4 walls around it. And the army would have had to have gone through 85 feet of walls to get inside. But Cyrus, he was smart. The soldiers dug a channel outside the city limits and diverted the river Euphrates, because the river Euphrates ran right between Babylon. Babylon was a great city, and it had buildings on both sides of the river Euphrates. And underneath the wall, there was a gate. And apparently Cyrus knew this. And so he said, if I can get the water level down, we can get into the city without having to go over the walls. When the water reached about midway up a man's thigh, the Persian soldiers entered the city via the riverbed. So sure the city would not be taken, the Babylonians grew careless. Therefore, the Persians came upon them by surprise and took the city. And I have there the footnote of where you can find this quote. From the Babylonian Chronicles, we learn that Babylon fell on the 16th day of Tishri, or on October 12, 539, according to our calendar. In conclusion, King Belshazzar of Babylon made his life choices. Later, God weighed those choices to see how they measured up. Belshazzar's choices were found wanting. And so I have to ask the question tonight, what about you? What about me? If, and consider this question, if God were to write on our wall tonight, what would he write for you and for me? Hopefully, it's not that we're wanting. God respects our choices. He leaves us free to obey him or to disobey him as we please. And in the judgment, since we are responsible individuals, he permits us to meet the ultimate consequences of our choices, whether good or bad. Centuries prior to the days of Daniel, Joshua expressed God's attitude about our freedom in these famous words that I will read now. And if you be willing to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers who served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua 24:15. So I ask the question, will you determine to serve the Lord tonight, my dear friends? That is the 5th chapter of Daniel, the writing on the wall. Quite dramatic indeed, but very solemn. Things for us to consider